9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio, coming to you direct from our super-secret studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark in Washington, D.C., and from other undisclosed locations across America and around the world. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Deep State Radio. This is David Rothkopf. I am your host here in our tiny studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark here in Washington, D.C. I'm joined here in Washington by Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University. We have coming to us from a studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Graham Allison of Harvard University, and from sunny Palo Alto, California, we have Kori Schake of Stanford University. This is the much-touted Thucydides cage match that everybody who is a listener of Deep State Radio has been looking forward to throughout the summer, thus proving what a hopeless bunch of nerds they are. But having said that, they're just the kind of people who would buy Graham's book, take it to heart, and use it to influence the world, because after all, we are, our listeners and all of us, members of the Deep State. Graham, I'd like to start with you. And I was wondering if you could encapsulate in a minute or two the thesis at the core of your book pertaining to the Thucydides Trap.
So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to appear on the program with Kori and Rosa. So Thucydides Trap is the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. Thucydides wrote about this in the classical case of Athens versus Sparta, in probably the most quoted one-liner in Western international relations studies, in which he said, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable." So in this book, I look at the last 500 years. I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. So think of the rise of Athens, but also think of the rise of Germany and the impact it had on Britain. Think of the rise of China today and the impact it's having on the U.S. Of these 16 cases, 12 of them in war, 4 of them in not war. So Thucydides' line about inevitable is hyperbole, but it would not be an exaggeration to say that under those conditions, there's an extreme danger of war occurring.
Well, that is as cogent and concise a summary of this book, which I have read and I recommend to everybody, as you could imagine. And it's not always the author who gives the most cogent and concise summary of a book, and I'm grateful for that. Kori, you've taken issue with some of the ways Thucydides and his conclusions have been characterized by many, not specifically by Graham, over the course of this past summer. And so I thought maybe you could frame your perspective on that.
So gladly, David and Graham and Rosa. So it's true that Thucydides does summarize his own history of the Peloponnesian Wars in that way. But I think there are two important things to remember. The first is that when he starts writing this history, he's desperately angling for Pericles, the ruler of Athens, to end his exile and let Thucydides come home. So he's putting a really nice face on the behavior of the Athenians, who much more than Sparta are responsible for the war that comes. So if there is a Thucydides trap, it gets sprung by the rising power, not by the established one. The second thing I would say about Thucydides is that it is too simplistic a summary to say that a rising power is inevitably going to come into conflict with an with the dominant power. Because the thing that Thucydides makes so clear time and again in the council in Athens, in the council in Sparta, in the Mytilene example, in the Melian dialogue, is that nothing is inevitable. It's human choice, it's decisions, it's populace persuading the public to make reckless choices that drive war. So I think the notion that Graham popularizes, that there's somehow a mousetrap that gets sprung when the hegemon refuses to tolerate any longer a rising power, I don't think that's an accurate read of Thucydides. And when we get a chance, I would love to come back on two other points that I'd like to hear more from Graham about. One is the case selection. And the second is the description of China in the book. Because I think in both of those cases, there are alternative perspectives.
Ooh, them's fighting words.
Yeah, and I think I've just looked at Rosa, and we speak in hand signals here, and I think we'd like to cede our time here back to Graham so we can respond to Kori's initial assertions, and then we'll circle back to you, Kori, and your other points. And then sooner or later, Rosa and I will come in and agree with whoever sounds like they're doing better.
I think that's a good plan, David.
Are the Greek chorus then?
Very much so.
So Graham, I feel the need to assure you that it's likelier they will support you than me because I talk to them twice a week on all these subjects.
Okay, yeah, that's that may make them more friendly or less friendly, who knows? But in any case, so first let me applaud Kori for taking Thucydides seriously. As I say in the penultimate paragraph of the book, if the only thing I can do in the book is persuade you that you should go download the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides and read at least the first book, the first 100 pages, then I will have succeeded. So Kori is a serious student of Thucydides, and I applaud that. And I would say to the listeners, you won't believe if you just download the Peloponnesian War and read it. Every page will knock your socks off. If it doesn't, check your pulse. Okay. So to the points. First, what Thucydides' proposition is not about one of the parties attacking the other and when and under what circumstances. His central proposition is a fundamentally realist proposition that says when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, this creates severe, predictable structural stress. And under these conditions, it's possible a rising power will become more aggressive and ultimately become the trigger to a war. It's possible that the ruling power will become paranoid and become the source of the war. It's equally likely that some external action or some third party's action that would otherwise be inconsequential or fairly easily managed can serve as the trigger to a set of actions and reactions that end in a war that neither party wanted. And I think I would, if I understand Kori's position, because I think I've seen something she wrote separately. I think I mainly agree with her that in this case, basically, it wasn't that Athens or Sparta concluded, boy, now's a good time for a war. If it hadn't been for Corinth as a big source of the problem, and it spat with Corcyra, a third-party actions that then entangled each of the parties with their allies, one wouldn't have got to the point that one got to. Now then, when Thucydides looks at that, he says, yes, but the deep driver in all this story is a rising versus a ruling power, which allows such an otherwise inconsequential debate to become so devastating. And I think that's actually, in my reading, what happened in 1914. So the idea that the assassination of an archduke became a trigger to a war that burned out all the houses of Europe is insane. Whenever I read that history, and when I try to do that in the chapter in the book, I still find it unbelievable. But it happened. And if I look at the Chinese-American relationship today, could North Korea, with what it's currently doing, drag China and the U.S. into war? That seems inconceivable, but we should remember what happened in 1950.
I really like the way in the book you use the example, as you just did here, of a marginal spat between unimportant allies being the precipitating event that draws the two hegemonic powers, the rising and the established one, into conflict. And I can see the projection of that to your policy recommendations in the book, right? Where you question towards the end whether the United States really has an interest in East Asia and whether we should really be so committed to the outcomes of the allies that we have in that region. And as of course Graham describes, Thucydides, it's the trigger of the whole thing, right? What Athens is saying is we should be able to behave any way we want. And Sparta, which is a tolerant hegemon, which doesn't interfere in the internal dynamic of its allies, they're not predatory in the way that Athens is predatory.
Basically, you're looking for the Chinese dominance of global politics. Is that right, Kori? Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be so good for us all. But what comes through so clearly in Book 1 of Thucydides is that it is Pericles' belief that war is inevitable. Pericles, the Athenian leader, keeps saying, this is inevitable. It's going to happen anyway. We might as well take it now. That's what actually makes war inevitable. So Thucydides does not say, this is the natural outcome. He says a political leader in the rising country, a country that is xenophobic and aggressive and not acknowledging the rules by which everyone else is playing, that power, thinking war is inevitable, is what causes them to repeatedly be aggressive. And one of the, Graham looks at 16 examples of established powers and rising powers. I rate the cases slightly differently. I think there's only one example of a dominant power giving way peacefully to a rising power. And that single case is Britain and the United States in the 19th century. And what makes that alone among all hegemonic transitions peaceful is that Britain and the United States by the end of the 19th century come to look similar to each other and different from everyone else. And so for Thucydides, there are no powers that are so similar ideologically that their cumulative power can be seen as a net gain for both. But that is both true of Britain and the United States by the end of the 19th century, and it's mostly true of the liberal international order that the United States began trying to create as it became increasingly dominant, and then succeeded in creating at the end of World War II. So one of the challenges I would put to Graham is that I think there's several things going on that Thucydides, classic that he is, couldn't capture. And one of those is the rise of liberal states which view each other in common terms and create an international order that is mutually beneficial for everyone. The second thing that I think is very different from the framework Thucydides set up and that Graham carries forward is that nuclear weapons may also play that stabilizing force, that common culture played between Britain and the United States at the end of the 19th century.
Go ahead, Graham.
Can I jump in on the first point? Because I love Kori's characterization of what I think is one of the most fascinating cases, namely the rise of the U.S., first the rival and then eclipse Britain at the beginning of the century, the 20th century. And actually, I have a chapter I think many Americans will find very uncomfortable, in which I try to read that through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt, a 37-year-old who arrives in Washington in 1897 to become the number 2 person in the Department of the Navy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt has for a long time been saying it's an abomination to have these foreigners in our hemisphere, especially the Spanish in Cuba. But he didn't like seeing British ships in our area either. In the decade that follows 1897, his arrival in Washington, the U.S. first seizes on the mysterious explosion in Havana to declare war on Spain, liberate Cuba, take Puerto Rico. We pick up Guam as a spoil of war. To support and sponsor a coup in Colombia, create a new country, Panama, who gives us the next day a contract for our canal so our ships can move from Atlantic to Pacific. Threatens war with first Germany and then with Britain, unless they back out of a territorial dispute in Venezuela. And then steals the largest part of the fat tail of Alaska from the Canadians because he thinks it reminds him of Yosemite. And then declares the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which says if any country in our hemisphere behaves in ways we don't like, we'll send the Marines and change the government. And we do that every year that follows for the next decade. Now, for the Brits, this was a big event, okay, because they've been accustomed to being the dominant power, including in the Western Hemisphere, for 100 years. But I think what they did, and I think this could be a longer conversation that I look forward to with Kori, would be partly they understood the realities of the situation and distinguished between what was vital for Britain, which they thought Canada was as part of the empire, and what was not vital, which is playing the role they had played for 100 years in places like Venezuela. So they accommodated in areas that they could adapt and adjust, but they were able to hold on to the things they regarded as vital. And they did the whole thing so artfully that by the end of the process, the Americans imagined that our interests were very much aligned with theirs. Now, part of that is a reflection in the similar cultures, and there's no doubt about that. But I think a good part of it is in the mastery of statecraft by the British statesmen.
Well, I'd like to follow up, if I could. Okay, Kori, one quick response, and then let's open it up a little bit.
I agree with you that this notion of common culture is a creation that follows the strategic alignment, right? The notion of Anglo-America doesn't precede the strategic convergence, it follows it. I, however, mark it earlier than you do. I think the 1895 Venezuela debt crisis, when Grover Cleveland's in office, is when that transition takes place.
I knew you were going to bring up the 1895 Venezuela debt crisis. You always bring it up.
Of course you did. Yeah. I know. It's so important.
I think there's a special Grover Cleveland bingo square.
Yeah, the drinking game.
But Graham is right. There is a period of time when the United States is becoming the dominant power in the order when we behave like a traditional 19th century European great power. But it's also important to emphasize that that phase passes relatively quickly, and that one of the things that I think is characteristic of hegemons is that they reshape the international order in the image of their domestic political compact. And so the United States, as it grows more powerful, actually grows more benevolent. And that's a difference from other hegemons, and it's at least on evidence based so far, a difference from the way China would behave. And that makes me think that the American dominated order is actually a lot more resilient than Graham gives it credit for managing a rising China.
Okay, so Graham, I'd like to ask you a question and sort of open this out and tie it a little bit into what's going on now. If I pick up on Kori's earlier point about Pericles and him sort of pushing everything in this direction of confrontation, it echoes a little bit of the way that some people, I think, have misused or been inclined to misinterpret your book. And I think a lot of people, including some people close to the President of the United States, have said, this is proof. We are going to go to war with China, and therefore let's get into a more confrontational stance. And so it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that case, a bit as it was in the case of Pericles. And it's particularly dangerous when you have a U.S. leader who doesn't actually have a worldview, and he is looking for confrontations in order to establish himself as someone of strength, when in fact that is not who he is. And does that worry you? And have you seen that out there?
Well, yes, indeed. And I think Bannon, who is a big Thucydides student and whose password was Sparta before he went to the White House. So he's a big fan of the Spartan point of view. And also is reported, I haven't spoken to him directly, but people I know who've talked to him at some length about this, as a kind of an apocalyptic view that there's going to be a big war, and China and the U.S. are the likely combatants. So he may have, such a perspective. If you contrast that with people like H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, or Jim Mattis, with whom Kori wrote a book, the Secretary of Defense, they have, I think, a better understanding of Thucydides. And I don't see in Thucydides any sense of inevitability about the war. As I say, I think if you look at that phrase that gets quoted over and over that made the war inevitable, it's hyperbole, exaggeration for the purpose of emphasis. In fact, for doing the book, I went back to recover my ancient Greek, which I studied when I was in college, and which it's still lousy. But in any case, if I have a side-by-side, I can do translation. And basically, if you look at the way he uses inevitable or forced in other settings, he just means very likely. So it would be like if in a tennis game we describe, a forced error. The answer is, under those circumstances, an error is much more likely, but not inevitable. And I think on Thucydides, on Pericles, maybe Kori and I differ slightly, and I'd have to go back and look at it because I hadn't looked at the text. But I think by the time Pericles is arguing that war is inevitable and so better now than later, he's already decided this is going to get us into a war, and this is a rationalization or justification for the war more than a motive. Like in our case here, after Bush had decided to go to war with Saddam, people began to exaggerate the nuclear dimension of things in order to justify it, not as a motivation.
So, Graham, you don't listen in probably to every episode of Deep State Radio, although you really should. Everybody should.
But I've heard some,
You've heard
and
some.
I like them.
Yeah, well, it's very high quality. And as you may have picked up in the shows that you've listened to, Rosa is our prophet of doom. She takes the bleakest attitude towards almost everything, from the weather to the future of mankind. And Rosa, as you listen to this sort of set of theses that suggest that conflict with China, between the U.S. and China, is something, is at least an idea we must contend with, if not absolutely inevitable. How does that?
Naturally, I find this very appealing, David.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking probably.
So I have to start by saying that I'm embarrassed to say that my understanding of Pericles was formed primarily through a teenage affection for Mary Renault's fiction, and I haven't read Thucydides since I was a college student.
pretty nerdy.
That is pretty nerdy too, I admit. But although Graham is inspiring me to go and reread Thucydides, which I cannot read in the original Greek, unfortunately. But no, I actually take Graham to be saying something that is extremely important, regardless of whether, Graham, you're right on the history, which I can't evaluate, and I'm perfectly happy to assume that you are. But even if you were wrong on the history, it strikes me that what you come out with in terms of lessons for us to be thinking about today are valid, notwithstanding, which is that it's hard to dispute the notion that when you have a rising power, that creates a very destabilizing moment that is fraught with danger. It's hard to dispute the idea that, historically speaking, when we've seen that in the past, it's often led to inadvertent escalation, miscalculations, and bad things happening, and that we're clearly at another such moment. So I, even without really feeling that I have the ability to weigh in much on the historical parallels or the analysis of Thucydides himself, it seems to me that where Graham comes out in terms of saying, it's not inevitable. The conflict is certainly not inevitable, but there's an enormous danger. This is a moment of enormous danger that requires great care. That seems right. I mean, unfortunately, in keeping with my generally apocalyptic leanings, I don't feel particularly good about the likelihood that anyone in the current White House is going to take any of Graham's various lessons to heart, because the degree of thoughtfulness and care required to avoid slipping into conflict is enormous, and obviously thoughtfulness and care are not things that appear to be in great supply at the moment in the White House.
So basically, if you, yeah,
go ahead.
So Rosa, I like the point, and I think that if we ask ourselves, actually, because the phenomenon that I'm interested in exploring, and that I think Thucydides captured in his insight about the trap, is if you look at dominance hierarchies in animals, at chimpanzees. If you look at family relations in which a kid that's shorter becomes taller than the kid that used to be the big kid, or the uncle becomes now the big guy in the family, the phenomenon in which or if we look in the valley, in Silicon Valley, you have a disruptive upstart and an incumbent. So they're very predictable behaviors of a rising power who says, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I deserve more say, I deserve more sway. The current arrangements which are in place, which were made before I was even here, before my interests were taken into account, need to adjust. And the ruling power, looking at this same situation, says, wait a minute, the current status quo is great. It's actually provided an environment for everybody that's made everybody have opportunities. How did you even grow up to be big and strong? It was in the environment that I created. So you should actually help share the responsibility for sustaining that. And I think that dynamic, one can, feel intuitively as well as observe. So from a Chinese, I was out in Beijing 3 weeks ago talking about Thucydides Trap. The people in the government extremely interested in the question, how to avoid. So from their perspective, looking out, they see the American Navy as the arbiter of events in the South China Sea. That seems to them to be anomalous. South China Sea, as one of them pointed out, look at what it's called on the map. It's called South China Sea. In fact, in the book, I have a section called China Seas, China Seas. So they think this is their sea. They think this looks like the Caribbean, looks to Americans. And I think that understandably, as they get bigger and stronger, they're pushing us out of there if they can. So that's why currently we basically operate mostly behind the first island chain for scenarios. And I think they'll continue pushing and adapt. So now the question is, under those circumstances, take a North Korea. So North Korea decides, let's just continue testing so that we can threaten the American homeland. We look and say, absolutely not. You can't do that. If we end up attacking North Korea to prevent it acquiring the capability to attack the American homeland, what the likelihood that ends in a war between the U.S. and China? Certainly not zero. certainly not zero. So I think basically it's under these conditions, it becomes more likely that third-party actions or these inconsequential external events, marginal spats, as I think Kori called them, end up triggering something that nobody wants. And so I think what you would wish is that we would have very adult conversations between both Americans and Chinese at a high level about how we can avoid and escape this. And that doesn't say where we adjust or accommodate and where we resist. Those become the, much more specific items. The main thing I'm worried about is stumbling into something that by mistake.
Well, Kori, I know you share that concern.
I do, and but it seems to me that the notion that states stumble into war with nobody intending it, right? This is Barbara Tuchman's great thesis from March of Folly. I find unpersuasive, and Thucydides would find unpersuasive, right? Athens doesn't stumble into war with Sparta. They choose it. And they choose it because they think they're going to win, and they think their interests are going to be advanced. So I think Geoffrey Blaney, the great Australian political scientist, is a better guide to this, right? Wars aren't car crashes. They're choices. And so a lot of in the book, I find some of Graham's recommendations to go further than the description that he just made, right? That, of course, we need to acknowledge China's rise. Of course, we need to be working with them to try and make sure there aren't misunderstandings, to find common ground where we can find it. But I actually think the United States is pretty good at that. We managed to do it well with Germany. We managed to do it well with Japan. I think we're doing it reasonably well with China. But I wouldn't want to go so far as to sacrifice primacy in the Western Pacific in order to reduce the risk of war with China. Because if you think allowing the South China Sea to be China's Caribbean, that will be enough to prevent war with China. That is, that they won't have appetite for anything else. I think it's certainly it would have been a misreading of the United States in 1895, and I think it's a misreading of China now. I think we and the Chinese need to work out a balance of what rules we're going to change in order to accommodate their interests and where we are going to hold a line, because we and our allies have continuing interests in preserving the existing order and not letting the Chinese chip away at it, and in not deluding ourselves to believe that they'll just stop at the South China Sea, because we wouldn't have when we were a rising power.
So
Graham,
let me agree and disagree. Yeah, I agree completely that basically accommodating China and expecting that enough is enough would be a big mistake. In the book, though, be clear, I do not recommend sacrificing primacy in the Western Pacific or adapting in one particular way or another. What I recommend is first that we recognize that the current strategy that we followed both under Republican and Democratic administrations of so-called engage but hedge is basically just gone with the flow. Whatever happens, happens. That's it. And whatever we do, we either call it engage or hedge. I think it's not been successful over these 25 years since the end of the Cold War. But secondly, that in thinking about how to adapt and adjust, we recognize the danger that's created, that's inherent in the structural situation, and therefore become much more imaginative about where we will adapt or adjust, how we will try to build and sustain which alliances that can be sustained, how we will try to agree with rules of the road for some period of time, because I think we should recognize China is serious about becoming the predominant power in the Western Pacific in the foreseeable future. That's what they want. If we are determined to prevent that, the current strategy will not do it.
Well, let me turn a question here to Rosa, and then it'll open out. But, I just want to introduce into this very rational thoughtful, citation-filled discussion, the notion of Donald Trump, who probably, as far
More in
as
common with Grover the Muppet than Grover Cleveland.
certainly, and who thinks grease is something his sons use in their hair, or possibly what you do to the palm of a politician you're trying to buy off. It's not necessarily a country, and certainly ancient Greece is completely beyond him. And these theories of rational behavior of countries come a cropper when you end up with leaders who are unaware of consequences or history. And the notion that Graham posits that, we accidentally do something with North Korea that throws us into conflict with China that we hadn't really thought out seems possible even with the access of adults that are supposedly around Trump. And in fact, it happens throughout history. And we could probably come up with 16 examples of wars through history that were actually created by accident. World War I comes to mind.
There was a great headline for a piece in Foreign Policy a few months back, something along the lines of Donald Trump making the great man theory of history great again. No, and I think that's the open it's the open question, right? I mean, for years we've all had debates about usually starring whoever happens to be the leader of Iran or North Korea, generally speaking. Sometimes Iraq and Saddam Hussein's period. We've all had these conversations in which we say, well, is so and so a rational actor? And we wonder whether so and so is really crazy and whether all of our theories about deterrence and realism hold any sway. If you have an actor who is actually just nuts, and we're now that guy, or collectively speaking, the U.S. Donald Trump specifically is that guy about whom presumably the North Koreans are sitting there scratching their heads right now and saying, yes, but the question is Donald Trump a rational actor? I suspect that they are, right? I mean,
at the Pyongyang Council on Foreign Relations,
they're having learned discussions about yes, but don't all of our calculations come to naught if in fact Donald Trump is not a rational actor, as indeed it seems increasingly likely we are forced to conclude that he is not. So no, we all continue to cling to the axis of adults' fantasy. And may it yet come true? We certainly hope so, because I do think that the greatest danger in terms of U.S.-China relationships is less an inadvertent miscalculation on the part of China, and more a crazy miscalculation on the part of Donald Trump.
Kori?
Yes, I do think the Council on Foreign Relations in Pyongyang ought to be worried that we have actually managed to flip the tables on them.
Diabolically clever.
Right. Their asymmetric advantage of a completely irrational, dangerous leader. And wow, the United States managed to play that hand too. I, however, am not as worried as most other national security analysts are about war with North Korea for two reasons. First, my theory of the case is that the North Korean government is actually principally concerned about regime survival. And I don't believe that they are irrational enough to think that any war with the United States concludes with the regime remaining in power. So I think they are on a rational course to try and get across the nuclear threshold and to being a nuclear possessor that could attack the United States as fast as possible, because right now they're straddling a barbed wire fence, and that seldom ends well for anyone. And in the case of President Trump, I do think the main restraint on American aspirations to solve the North Korean nuclear threat are the fact that even if we could carry out an exquisite military attack that identified all of their nuclear weapons, mobile and stationary, and in the space of 2 hours could destroy those 8,000 artillery tubes that are looking down the barrel to Seoul, South Korea, even if we could do that perfectly, there are probably still 300 dead South Koreans in those first 2 hours. And I can't see any American government, even Donald Trump's government, being reckless enough to put that many South Koreans at risk in order on the hopes that you could manage the North Korean nuclear threat.
Graham, we just have a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I don't know about the last word, but I'd say that I wish Kori's analysis was right. But in 1994, I was at the Pentagon as an assistant secretary. Bill Perry was the Secretary of Defense. Ash was an assistant secretary. Shally was the chairman. We were in favor of attacking North Korea then, recognizing that the costs might be 100 or several 100,000 people killed in Seoul, and maybe even a second Korean War. I still haven't changed my view about that. So that may have been crazy, but that was my view then. Actually, Ash and Bill Perry argued in a 2006, so this is now, once the situation has changed a lot, op-ed publicly, as they were arguing privately, that we should attack the ICBM on the North Korean ICBM on the launch pad rather than let it launch. So there have been people serious about attacking North Korea, God forbid. Secondly, I think for Trump, allowing North Korea to have the ability to strike the American homeland with nuclear weapons, he said is unacceptable. Now, I think when he thinks about what the alternative is, namely, we attack their launch pads, that prevents them testing, but what do they do to Seoul? And he goes through the consequences. If I listen to Secretary of Defense Mattis's testimony, he thinks it's going to be an attack on Seoul, and that's going to run a high risk of a second Korean War, and that's going to be horrific. So we're at the choice between things that are horrific and genuinely catastrophic. I think this is going to play out over the next several months, and I would say it's like a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion, and I don't feel comfortable where it's going to come out.
Well, I think that's a profoundly important insight and a very thought-provoking place to end this discussion. Many people do, by the way, describe this as a slow-motion crisis. I would point out that the speed with which North Korea is acquiring new capabilities is faster than it's ever been. And so while it may be slow motion, it's happening quicker than some of us are in the administration are responding to. I also think that the fact that this discussion of China and the Thucydides trap ends with a discussion of the Koreas underscores Graham's earlier point. You can't, for the next year or two, see the future of the U.S.-China relationship without looking at it through the lens of North Korea. And the situation there is much more dire and much more fraught with danger than many either acknowledge or are able to see because we're so caught up in our discussions of political chaos in Washington. Graham Allison's book is called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap? It is a very, very important book to read carefully. It is also a book that is better when taken in the context of thoughtful analysis and historical knowledge. So read Thucydides, as Graham suggests, turn to the sources that Kori suggests in her appreciation for the book. And I know she has the greatest respect for Graham Allison, as do each of us. And
she does.
I know that. You've said that before, even behind Graham's back. And for all of you who are out there listening to Deep State Radio, who came expecting a cage match, you got I think exactly what you came for, which is a thoughtful discussion on a really important subject from a couple of really smart people, and Rosa.
Wait a minute.
No, wait a minute. I didn't mean it that way.
David.
I didn't mean it
Just
that way.
because I don't know. Just because I can't read ancient Greek.
Yeah, well, you better go work on that. No. Thank you, Rosa, for being splendid as always. Thank you, Kori, for being splendid as always. Thank you, Graham, for joining us. We hope you will join us again. This is David Rothkopf for Deep State Radio. Please join us again, folks. Have your friends listen. Things are going great for Deep State Radio. The audience is growing weekly. We want them to join in with all of us. Talk to you again soon. Thanks, guys. Deep State Radio is a production of the Deep State Radio Network, a division of TRG Interactive Media. Our podcast today was produced in cooperation with Goat Rodeo Productions and was supervised by Ian Enright. Join us again for another episode of Deep State Radio. If you don't, we know where to find you.